I'm delighted to be here with you. I'll tell you really quickly that the origins of this panel were that a number of people on the panel have been involved in working with Tokitae and captive cetaceans. And we have been thinking about having a panel about Tokitae for World Aquatic Animal Day, but Tokitae passed. And so we said we need to do something to talk about what happened to her and what's happening to other captive animals. And so that's where the brainstorm for this panel came about, and we were lucky to get these wonderful experts. So what I'm going to do is talk really quickly, sort of an overview about a little bit of the landscape for captive cetaceans, and then you'll hear about science, and you'll hear some deep dives into the law and some alternatives, including sanctuary. All right, so I wanted to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the wonderful Camella Center with Dr. Lori Marino here, and the wonderful Farm Sanctuary with Miranda Eisen here representing them. So thanks to them for the food support for this program. And for online, that would be awesome. Thank you. So where I start each of the presentations is a reminder that in the law, generally speaking, animals are considered property. Aquatic animals are, if you will, even more considered property because they're ignored. Okay, great. So ownership of these animals, right, does not come with it, come with a mandatory agreement for responsible, which is really problematic. Problematic animals themselves are not seen as owning. They're seen as a plentiful resource. They're seen as designed to be used, generally speaking, only for human ends, right? And that's how we value the animals. Problematic. So because animals are not seen as valuable for themselves, we have all these problems that we're going to talk about. The law does not actually know how to value animals, right? It doesn't have a metric by which to do that. It doesn't have a metric that for humans or for the natural world either. So it's not unique to animals, but it is uniquely problematic here. And we know when there's no value attributed to an entity, no protection, right? And so that's abuse, neglect, cruelty, and extinction in this context. So we need to see the animals. We need to lift them up. We can have conversations about how best to help them. So invisibility, aquatic animals, is a significant problem. Literally don't see these animals. So we don't know who they are. That lack of interaction equals a lack of understanding and empathy. We also, for aquatic in uncountable numbers, right? And so we can use them as a resource without thinking about it. And we discount their value as individuals. So this helps us understand the important need for protection and the good news is there are alternatives to all of their uses. So science ends up being important in having these conversations. To go through all of them. I'm not sure. Okay. But cetaceans in particular have specifically many of these capacities. But the point is that there are studies indicating that aquatic animals have some of these capacities. And these are capacities we used to think, and were taught, at least when I was in grade school, right, that aquatic animals did not have. It's very significant. I can't even say what's happening there. If maybe you can help with that. So really quickly, sensitivity is one of the capacities on which we can make some, right? If animals are like us, if they're sentient in ways that we can understand, then we're more likely to think about giving protection. So we need to sort of understand that with the science behind sentience and behind capacities. So back to the relevance, and thank you for these suggestions, everybody online and here, to make this better. So we need to accept science, right? We need to, in the legal community, sort of understand what it is, keep up with it, because the science is evolving and we need to understand what it is and how to use it in the legal realm. We need to also see aquatic animals, right? Not as just a resource, not as just a set of species. And we need to keep up with our scientific literacy. And that's a project that the Camella Center and GW's Animal Law program are working on. Okay. All right, so going from there, once we know that sentience exists, it should result in some legal protections. And we know that sentience is a problematic marker, right? We know that it's human-centric and it's limiting. And so acknowledging that at the outset, that it's at least something that we have to begin with. So we need to be thinking about our existing duties to do no harm to animals. And then that brings into question what is unnecessary harm, right? Because that's in our legislation. What is harm? What is suffering? We need to establish some duties to use alternatives so that there's no harmful use allowed when alternatives are available, and a duty to develop alternatives to the use of animals. And we need to shift our defaults, right? We need to use precautionary principle. We should start to assume sentience exists for all animals unless proven otherwise, and shift the burden of proof to people who want to use animals, right? To explain why they can do this without harm. So there are an increasing number of scientific studies recognizing sentience and other capacities for animals, and it is having an impact on the legal realms in the US, in the UK, in the EU, and elsewhere. So this is a list that we can talk about a little bit more, but basically it's becoming enshrined in even constitutional level legal realities in countries, as well as local realities. So I'm not going to go deeply into the law because we have other experts here who are going to talk about that. I just want to sort of highlight that for aquatic animals, they're excluded from most of the protections of the few laws that we actually have that purport to protect animals, right? And that's very problematic. So we have some that are specifically protecting aquatic animals, like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and we have some that include them where others don't, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. In addition to the US legal perspectives, we have other legal perspectives that we should take into account, including tribal and indigenous perspectives, not just because it's respectful, which it is and important to do, but they actually are making greater strides here in the US in protecting some of their waterways and the animals within that than are we outside those jurisdictions. And obviously we need to be attentive to international legal perspectives as well. So I'm going to talk just really quickly in the cetacean captivity context about an example. Are most people familiar with the Tilikum case? So, okay, I'm seeing heads nodding. So there's both the factual case, right, of what happened with Tilikum at SeaWorld, and there's the legal case. And so what I have up here is a Venn diagram, if you will, of impacts related to the situation surrounding Tilikum. So at first there was the OSHA fines issued against SeaWorld after Tilikum killed the trainer. Then there was litigation filed by PETA, and then there was the documentary Blackfish. Together, these three things had a very large impact on the conversation around captive cetaceans and captive animals and animals used for entertainment, right? And that was a really positive thing. Some of those impacts, there were more OSHA fines. Animal advocates learned to use OSHA as a strategy, which was great. SeaWorld Orlando had significant impacts. There were boycotts. All of the musicians that year refused to perform that summer. Their stock price fell. They lied about why their stock price fell, and then they got in trouble with the SEC, and they had to pay them a settlement, and then they had to pay their shareholders a settlement. $65 million to their shareholders. So that was not insignificant. And so how they're operating, they no longer can have new, right, captive cetaceans, which is a good thing. Sadly, the last, don't know why it's doing that. The new park that SeaWorld has in Abu Dhabi does not include orcas, though it does include dolphins. Canada, we saw a national law, right, that's ending the captivity of whales and dolphins. There's a ban on breeding and importing in France. So we're making some significant progress. We have a lot to do. In California alone, after the Tilikum case, there were a number of lawsuits and regulatory sort of approaches to respond to the publicity, right, around Tilikum. And so the short summary of this slide is that in California, they passed the Orca Protection Act. And so that also bans the breeding of orcas and holding new orcas and allowing them to bringing in new orcas or letting them perform for entertainment. It does still allow educational presentations. And after, there was also, outside of California, a federal bill and a Florida bill. Those bills have failed and they haven't been reintroduced recently, but we'll see. Ongoing concerns include that we still have, despite this effort, despite these conversations, we still have the same number of captive killer whales that we did. We have failed, we had this failed effort that we'll talk about throughout the day for Lolita, also known as Tokitae. And we have this bizarre double standard where when we talk about taking these animals out of captivity, people say, oh, but are they going to be well? You know, what about their food? What about their health care? In ways that we don't talk about when they're in captivity, right? It's a really high burden. Oh, now we care about their welfare, right? But we're not meeting that same standard when they're in captivity, which is problematic. So there are a lot of things that we can think about in terms of responding to the situation. So there are lawsuits, there are state bans, there's protests and news reporting and studies, experts, and we can learn from what's happening in other parts of the animal law movement. In terms of thinking about the evolution of the legal status of animals in particular, and aquatic animals even more specifically, we have these evolving ideas, right? So if we don't want animals to be considered property, what would their legal status be? So there's property plus living property. The animal rights conception sometimes takes the place of property rights of nature, animals as rights holders, Pachamama, ethical conversations, tribal rights, precedents, and even the legal jurisdiction of water, right? So we have a lot of things that we can begin to think about rather than just animals or property in the traditional sense. And this is evolving. It's an ongoing conversation, so we don't know where it will land. But some of this innovation has led to positive outcomes. So people may have heard about the Port Townsend proclamation, Port Townsend on the West Coast, where they've, as a city, decided that orcas have the right to life, including adequate food supply from naturally occurring sources and freedom from conditions causing physical, emotional, or mental harm, including a habitat degraded by noise, pollution, and contamination. That's a pretty nice statement, right? So if we could have that for all of the animals, we'd be in really good shape. So that's a very recent innovation, and we'll see if there's definitely an effort to have other jurisdictions take this on as well. So we have also in 2018, the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians passed a resolution recognizing a sacred obligation to the southern resident orcas. Relatedly, not for captivitations, but the city of Ojai, California established the right to bodily liberty for elephants. And we have many jurisdictions with bans on captive cetaceans. So some may not be able to see it. If someone could stop drawing on the screen, that would be lovely. We have countries like Bolivia, China, Canada, Costa Rica, and so on. And we have US jurisdictions and some cities as well. So I just want to end with a happy story that people may not know about. How many people have heard of Springer, the orca? Many people don't know about this situation. So Springer was stranded in 2002, was captured and rehabilitated and released and successfully reintegrated with her pod in the Pacific Northwest. She's had 2 calves and maybe a third. So there are reintroduction stories that we actually don't know about, successful reintroduction stories. And that helps us, I think, when we're talking about the possibility of getting these animals out of captivity. So the Animal Law and Science Project and the Aquatic Animal Law Project are 2 of our projects here at GW, and working with the Camilla Center and also Farm Sanctuary. So that's been a lot. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass the baton on to Dr. Marino, and I'm going to check on the screen situation. So I'll be off for a second. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, as Kathy mentioned, a lot of the law in animal law depends upon having good science that can help you make the arguments you want to make and refute the arguments that are being levied. And so I want to talk about the current science on the welfare of captive orcas, because Tokitae is captive orca, and we have a lot of science accruing about what happens to these animals when they're put in concrete tanks. And as I said, we know that successful litigation, legislation, policy, advocacy of all kinds depends upon the scientific evidence. So we should ask ourselves, well, what is the evidence that cetaceans like orcas do not belong in marine parks? A lot of the work I'm going to tell you about was summarized in a recent paper, it's 2020 now, called The Harmful Effects of Captivity and Chronic Stress on the Well-Being of Orcas, that I co-authored in Journal of Veterinary Behavior. And we brought together all of the existing science at that time to try to understand what is going on with animals like Tokitae and others living in concrete tanks in marine parks. So let's take a look at some of the welfare issues for captive orcas. First of all, let's just take a look at lifespan statistics, right? In the wild, the average lifespan for orcas is 30 to 50 years, but some females can live 80, 90, 100, even 100 years. The average lifespan for captive male orcas is 13.4 years, and for females, 21.3 years. So you can see that they just don't live as long in the tanks. They live a small percentage of their average lifespan, let alone maximum lifespan. When you look at SeaWorld, 92% of all the orcas held there have died by the age of 25. So most of them die before they're 25. And that tells you something about how good an environment that is for them. If you look at survivorship and mortality rates, you see something very similar. In 2015, Jett and Bentry took a look at these, and what they noted is that since 1985, there have been improvements that have improved survivorship for orcas. Survivorship is just, how many survive to a certain age. And that has improved, but survival to sexual maturity and reproductive senescence remains poor compared to free-ranging orcas. It still does. Mortality rates for captive orcas is 2.5 times higher than in the wild. That's they're fed, they're protected, they have 24/7 great veterinary care, and yet their mortality rates are 2.5 times that of the animals in the wild. When you look at infant mortality statistics, you see something very alarming as well. Of the 103 orcas who have been born in captivity globally since 1985, 73 of them are already dead, with 48 dying in their first year. So the bottom line is orca birth rates and infant mortality rates have been at best the same or only slightly better in captivity than in the wild. So wrap your head around that, because these are born in the tank. There's no pollution, there's no predators, there's no ships. They got plenty of food and 24/7 veterinary. Let's take a look at some of the things that happen to them in terms of systemic or opportunistic infections. Many of the infections captive orcas succumb to are called opportunistic infections, meaning they take hold when the immune system is weak. And the immune system usually becomes weak under chronic stress conditions. Common causes of death for orcas in the tanks is pneumonia, gastrointestinal disease, meningitis, encephalitis, candidiasis. Now, wild orcas also die of pneumonia, gastrointestinal disease, etc. But these orcas are supposed to be in a clean system. So, but they're getting the same diseases that the ones in the wild are getting. What's really interesting about this is that many of these incidents of death from opportunistic infections are correlated with antibiotic and antifungal resistance. And this is brought about because they are prophylactically over-medicated. So they usually, captive orcas are given antibiotics, antifungals, just prophylactically. So by the time they actually do get sick from something, they're resistant, which is a huge problem, as you know. They're also given antidepressant and anti-anxiety drugs as well. And they're given them by just stuffing them into the dead fish and throwing the dead fish in their mouth. We also see oral stereotypies and dental disease in orcas who are captive. A stereotypy, as you may know, is just a repetitive abnormal behavior that indicates that there's something wrong with certain structures in the brain. We see it in humans, we see it in all kinds of species who are under tremendous stress or have psychopathology of one kind or another. For orcas in captive tanks, their oral stereotypy tends to be, and when they do that over several years, they end up with a dentition that looks like that. That's the lower jaw of a captive orca. And you can see there are no teeth. The teeth are ground down to the gum. And over 60% of captive orcas have tooth wear similar to this. A full 24% exhibit extreme or major mandibular coronal tooth wear, which means teeth like this. In the case of Tokitae, she was an exception to this. She had really good teeth. She did not perform the stereotypy, but this is something you see time and time again in captive orcas. These kinds of behaviors not only indicate that there's something wrong neuroanatomically, but also they lead to systemic disease as well. And then you see self-injurious and other abnormal behaviors. Here's 3 examples. On the left is Hugo. Hugo was captured from the wild when he was a child, maybe 3 or 4. And in fact, he lived in the same tank with Tokitae. But he's not there now because he bashed his head against the side of the tank repeatedly. And he eventually died of a brain aneurysm. That's not something that kind of self-injurious behavior is something that you will see in orcas and other cetaceans held in these impoverished environments. In the middle is Morgan. And Morgan's an orca, a female orca. And as you can see, she's not actually in the water. She's at Loro Parque in Spain. She's not in the water. She's on the side of the tank. And the reason she's on the side of the tank is because she beached herself there. And the reason she did that is because there are too many aggressive male orcas in the tank with her. And she had to actually get out of the water to get away from them. Okay, so as you can tell, obviously, in the wild, nothing like that happens. They use natural dispersal methods to keep aggression down. And finally, on the right, Corky and Candu, which is a more dramatic example. Corky and Candu were both at SeaWorld San Diego. They were in a show, they collided. Candu bled out, as you can see there. It was during the show in front of the audience and in front of her calf. And Corky is still alive. She's the only remaining orca in North America who was captured from the wild. She's about 56, 55, and she's at SeaWorld San Diego. She is still hanging in there. But these are the kinds of things that happen when they're in a small enclosed environment. So the central question posed by all of this evidence is this: if captive orcas are fed, have veterinary care, and live in a protected environment, why aren't they living long, healthy lives? And the only answer to that is the fact that they are being forced to live in a situation that does not conform, that they are not evolved or adapted to live in, let alone thrive in. It's captivity. It's an impoverished environment. So despite all of this great human care, they are still not living as long and dying more often than those in the wild. So I want to thank you and turn things over to Georgia.
Thank you, Lori. And 2 intro slides. I'm Georgia Hancock. I'm with the Animal Welfare Institute as their Marine Life Program Director and Senior Staff Attorney. So, as you may know, at least 45 juvenile southern resident killer whales were captured and delivered to marine parks between 1965 and 1973. Toki was captured in one of those roundups in August 1970. With just 75 individuals as of July 2023, that population of killer whales is critically endangered, in part because that whole generation of calves that were captured wasn't there to help, carry the species forward and help them recover. So following these and other captures of cetaceans and other marine mammals for theme parks in the 60s and 70s, the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1972. The MMPA allows the Secretary of Interior or Commerce to issue permits for takes from the wild or for imports. It's administered by the National Marine Fisheries Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, depending on the species. And Section 104 of the law is where a party can obtain a special exception permit for such a thing as public display or scientific research or enhancement of the species. These permits specify the number and kind of animals and the location and manner of take, the time period for which the permit's valid, and other terms and conditions. For wild takes, the permits specify the method of capture, supervision, and transportation during the taking. These permits are only issued to parties to offer a program of education or conservation based on the professionally recognized standards of the public display community. Well, how's that? I mean, if the display community is setting the standards, it's not exactly ideal for the animals. But the permits also can only be issued to parties that hold an AWA license and have facilities that are open to the public on a regularly scheduled basis. These permits are issued after public review. It's typically it's always a public comment period and then sometimes a public hearing as well. And one way that the MMPA has succeeded, I think, in protecting wild marine species is because of the provision that it's unlawful to import into the U.S. any marine mammal that was taken from a species or stock that's been designated as depleted, which means that species or stock is not at its optimum sustainable population. NIMS has implementing regulations at 50 CFR Part 216 that list out the requirements for a special exception permit, including the application process, special issuance criteria, such as takes have to be humane, they can't pose an unnecessary risk to animal health or welfare. If a threatened or endangered marine mammal stock or individual is involved, it must comply with Section 2 of the ESA. There can be no likely adverse impact on the species or stock, and other things having to do with the facility itself that they would go to, care and maintenance, and so forth. These regs also spell out permit restrictions, including limits on imports. These permits are typically given for 5-year periods of time, after which the facility would have to reapply for another 5-year period. And they can't be issued for animals that are nursing or less than 8 months old. They can't be in mother-offspring pairs, and there can be no release into the wild without scientific research or an enhancement permit. So unfortunately, because Toki was captured before the enactment of the MMPA, that law did not apply to her at all, but it did apply to wild captures following the enactment in 1972. The 2 federal laws that did apply to Toki were the Animal Welfare Act and the Endangered Species Act. The AWA was passed in 1966 and then applied to exhibitors in 1972 in order to ensure the humane care and treatment of various animals used in research or for exhibition or kept as pets. The AWA is administered by the Animal Care Section of the Animal Plant Health and Inspection Service, which is part of USDA. It requires minimum standards of care and treatment for certain animals bred for commercial sale, used in research, transported commercially, or exhibited to the public. And it sets general standards for humane handling, care, treatment, and transportation. APHIS is required to inspect all of the facilities that it licenses under the AWA. In 1979, APHIS promulgated its marine mammal-specific regulations, which contain standards for facilities, space requirements, feeding, water quality, sanitation, employees in attendance, separation, vet care, and transportation. These standards were last updated in 1984. And so they're now very, very outdated, especially given how much science has evolved in that time. I mean, really, basically all of the important science that we know about marine mammals has occurred in that almost 40-year period. So in 2016, the Obama administration published a proposed rule to update these regs, which AWI commented on extensively. And then we actually turned that into a law review, or a law journal article. So that's available publicly if you'd like to check it out. So while we didn't feel that 2016 proposed rule went as far as it could in terms of how much, science has learned in that time, it would have been better than nothing. And unfortunately, it was shelved during the Trump administration. So with respect to Toki, I think it's important to flag that her tank was the smallest orca enclosure in the world. It was only 80 feet long and 35 feet wide at its widest point, and a mere 20 feet deep. And it never met the space requirements laid out by the marine mammal regs for the AWA. this is a fact that APHIS spent decades trying to skirt around until 2022, when it issued a new license to the new owners of Miami Seaquarium. When it issued that license, it did something very bizarre. It excluded the whale stadium, Toki, and her tank mate, Li'i, from the license. It said they're not covered by the license. So, and it did that because the tank was too small. It could not pass the tank under the AWA standards. So it couldn't cover it in the license. So instead of rejecting the license altogether, it just took that part of it out and said, we're not going to regulate, we're not going to apply the AWA to Toki and Li'i anymore. We had a really big problem with that, and we we wrote to them to tell them so. And even though the AWA and its standards are far from perfect, because they only set that sort of bare minimum, again, that's better than nothing. And for the last year and a half of Toki's life, the AWA was not being applied to her. And, within the past few years, also, APHIS had actually started citing MSQ, Miami Seaquarium, for violating the AWA's regs, but when they were still applying it to Toki, and even afterwards with regard to the rest of the park. There was a really bad 2021 citation where they were cited for making Toki perform behaviors that led to an injury. They were feeding her rotten fish. And the caretaking team wasn't following the instructions of the attending veterinarian. So APHIS wrote them up for that. I guess it's just, it's evidence that even though those standards are pretty low, they do stand for something. So the other federal law that applied to Toki, at least in name, was the Endangered Species Act, which Congress passed in 1973. Like the MMPA, the ESA is also administered by the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And its permit requirements are found at 50 CFR Part 222. In 2005, the population that Toki was taken from, the southern resident killer whales, was listed as endangered under the ESA. But at first, Toki wasn't included in that listing. Following a petition from several NGOs, and I think PETA led that, that listing was eventually applied to Toki in 2015. And they called that, they said, we're not going to do a split listing. We're going to include her, since she's part of that stock, we're going to include her in the listing. As Kathy mentioned, litigation sort of followed that, that listing. And at one point, a court essentially determined that as long as the Animal Welfare Act was being applied to Toki, the ESA was not being violated. However, as I mentioned, as of March 2022, when Miami Seaquarium's AWA license no longer covered the whale stadium in Toki and Li'i, it was not the case that the AWA was, being applied. And so arguably the ESA began to be violated at that point as well. We wrote to APHIS and the National Marine Fisheries Service to alert them to this, and they did not seem to agree with our position. The other laws that applied to Toki, state law, Florida's animal cruelty law, applied to her, but unfortunately there were no marine mammal specific regs. So that made taking action under that state law pretty challenging. And then finally, local regs, ordinances didn't directly apply to her, but they applied to the facility where she was held. So the county safe structures rules were actually Miami Seaquarium was cited for not meeting the safe structures requirements within the past few years. And that led in part to the closing of that exhibit to the public, because the stadium seating literally was not safe for people to go on, which is very disturbing. So I think one thing that the vast majority of people who care or cared about Toki can agree on is that the existing laws failed her. And that brings us to what else can we do for captive marine mammals? So one of the things we've been working on is the SWIMS Act, the Strengthening Welfare in Marine Settings Act of 2022. This bill, if enacted, would phase out the captive display of orcas, beluga whales, pilot whales, and false killer whales by prohibiting breeding, the take or wild capture, import and export. It would not prohibit the continued holding of these species currently in captivity, giving the parks and aquariums time to transition to a more humane future. And what else can we do? So as I said, those marine mammal regulations from APHIS are in dire need of updating. We actually, thanks to Allison who's here in the audience today, we got some language inserted into an appropriations bill, or report rather, an ag appropriations report that where the ag committee was basically urging APHIS to update its marine mammal standards. So we're hopeful that this will actually compel APHIS to get the ball rolling on this. Another thing we'd like to see happen is for improved necropsy requirements. So right now, facilities, they do prepare necropsies, but they're not required to submit them to the government. We would like to see the law change so that the facilities are required to submit the necropsies, which are the like autopsies for animals. So that they're required to submit them to the government so that they're then available to the public through FOIA. Let's see, I think Kathy covered the state and local regs. So I'll just skip on to, if you'd like to read more, AWI recently published the 6th edition of the Case Against Marine Mammals in Captivity, which is quite an extensive document. It has a number of chapters on education and health and stress and interactions, and it's available on our website at this link, and it's a great place to start if you'd like to read up more on what's going on with captive marine mammal welfare and public policy and the law and so forth. So thank you.
Somebody's gonna have to show me how to do
Oh,
this.
just click the mouse, like right there.
Or you can just use this.
Oh, okay.
Okay, whatever.
There you go. Then you want to click.
Wait, which?
Just that button.
Oh, thank you. Hi. My name is Elizabeth Stein. I'm the litigation director for the Non-Human Rights Project. And I'm actually bringing a slightly different perspective to this, because Up until this point, the Non-Human Rights Project has not filed a lawsuit on behalf of a cetacean. Hopefully, with the help of my esteemed colleague, Lori, we will be doing that in the near future. But thus far, we have only filed petitions on behalf of chimpanzees and elephants. And what I'm really finding so informative is that, and I hope you'll see the same thing, as we go through elephant capacities and elephant captivity, chimpanzee capacities, chimpanzee captivity, you're going to see such a striking similarity between that and what is happening to cetaceans in captivity. So what I'm going to do is kind of give you a snapshot of some of our clients and then go into the law a little bit. So meet Happy. She is our elephant client who she is a 52-year-old female Asian elephant who has spent the last 46 years of her life as an attraction on display at the Bronx Zoo. In 1972, when she was only a year old, she was forcibly taken from her herd, her natural habitat, and the community of elephants in which she was evolved to thrive. In 1977, Happy was sent to the Bronx Zoo, where in addition to being on display, she was used for rides, elephant tug-of-war contests, and elephant tricks through the 1980s. And from last I heard, elephants in the wild do not give rides, they don't do tug-of-war, and they don't do tricks. So what does a day in the tragic life of Happy look like at the Bronx Zoo? Since 2018, Happy and Patty are the sole remaining elephants there. Sadly, the Bronx Zoo claims that Happy and Patty don't get along, which is based on a very unfortunate incident that happened between Patty and Happy's companion. And because of that fact, they cannot share the same physical space. So Happy spends her days isolated from any kind of elephant companionship, either in a tiny barn, a tiny barren cement-walled elephant yard, a 1-acre zoo exhibit that she must share with Patty on a rotational basis, or a windowless barn where she stays at night or in inclement weather, which, as we know, in the Bronx can be a very good part of the year. When indoors, Happy can be seen standing facing the fence or gate, dusting, swinging her trunk in stereotypical behavior, as Lori was talking about, standing with 1 or 2 legs lifted off the ground, either to take weight off painful feet or again, engaging in stereotypical behavior. But what does all of this mean with respect to elephants? What do we know about the capabilities and needs of elephants? Well, thanks to the experts who have been studying elephants both in the wild and in captivity for decades, we know that elephants are autonomous, extraordinarily cognitively complex, self-aware, and social. They understand and remember the past and plan for the future. They are deeply empathetic and remember the past and the future. They grieve the loss of their loved ones. In the wild, we know that Happy would have been the matriarch of an extended family. She would have spent more than 20 hours every day traveling many miles across diverse terrains to locate resources, maintain her body, connect with friends, and search for mates. She would have intricate social and familial networks and bonds. She would have engaged in complex intentional communication with other elephants to make decisions, solve problems, and resolve conflicts. She would teach elephants and pass down knowledge from one generation to the other. The moment Happy was torn from her herd and natural habitat, her life as an elephant ended. Every day at the Bronx Zoo, she suffers both the physical and psychological harms of captivity. Elephants in captivity tend to be obese, they have shorter lifespans, they develop arthritis, and foot ailments and brain damage as exhibited by their stereotypical behavior. But as the experts explain, Happy can regain her life as an elephant if placed in a sanctuary where her autonomy will be respected and where she will be able to live as close to a natural elephant life as possible. And I think it's so stunning because so much of what we know about Happy and elephants is so similar to what Lori just discussed with respect to cetaceans.
Striking parallel.
Striking, absolutely striking. And it's also striking to me because, you know, I went through the laundry list of elephant capabilities, which are, you know, the more I read about it and the more I study based on our experts, the more in awe I am of elephants as a species. And I remember when we were filing our first petitions, and I said to the founder of the Non-Human Rights Project, Stephen Wise, who is the true luminary, in my opinion, in the field of animal rights. And I said, you know, Steve, this petition is huge. And 50 pages of the petition are facts. I said, the judges are not going to read the facts. And he said, Liddy, I don't like to argue with you and I don't like to pull rank, but I'm arguing with you and I'm pulling rank. The facts are staying in. Fine. He was so right and I was so wrong, because what I have learned, and I'll be talking about our lawsuits, the judges care. The judges read the affidavits. They read the pages and pages of facts that we put in, and it made all of the difference in the world. So this is Tommy. He was the first client of the Non-Human Rights Project. He's a chimpanzee. When we found Tommy, he was living alone in a cage in a shed on a used trailer lot in Gloversville, New York, right outside of Albany. The concrete walls were painted to look like a jungle, and his only company was a television. When asked about this by a reporter for the Albany Times-Union in 2013, Tommy's owner said that Tommy likes being by himself. But the work of the foremost primatologists from around the world tells an entirely different story about chimpanzees. We know they are autonomous, cognitively and emotionally complex, self-aware, self-conscious, self-determining beings who have the capacity to live intellectually rich and sophisticated individual, family, and community lives. They are highly social and live in fluid subgroups. They can construct and use hundreds of tools, and a large part of a chimpanzee day should be foraging for food. They have the capacity for empathy, experience pleasure, grief, depression, and boredom. They engage in cooperation, altruism, deception, and cultural transmission of learned behavior. They are arboreal, which means they live off the ground and are natural climbers. Like elephants, chimpanzees remember their past and plan for their future. They engage in something called mental time travel, which means that they have the ability to communicate about past events and say what they intend to do in the future. And when their future is imprisonment, they suffer the enduring pain of isolation and the inability to fulfill their life's goals. Like elephants, chimpanzees in captive environments who are unable to exercise their autonomy and engage in species-typical behavior suffer severe physical and psychological harm. And very much to the point that Lori was making with respect to chimpanzees, they also they engage in self-destructive behavior. They pull their hair, they bite themselves, they bite one another. It's horrible. So why is it that Tommy can be kept alone in a cage such as that, and Happy can be living on a tiny plot of land in the Bronx? It's because animal welfare laws do not recognize a non-human animal's fundamental right to liberty. These laws are basically designed to keep the animals in captivity and regulate the manner in which they're kept. An animal rights paradigm focuses on the animal for the sake of the animal, not for the sake of humans. So for purposes of the animal welfare laws, the captivity of these non-human animals is perfectly fine. Although we recognize that animal welfare laws are important, they are tragically inadequate, especially for autonomous animals like Tommy and Happy. Just like humans, the only way to truly protect the fundamental interests of non-human animals is to recognize their rights. The Non-Human Rights Project is the only organization dedicated solely to securing legally recognized and enforceable rights for non-human animals. We work to secure these rights through litigation, legislation, and education. Our legal arguments are based on evolving standards of science, justice, morality, liberty, equality, fairness, and the intrinsic values of society. We argue that to deny a non-human animal a right simply because that individual is not human is arbitrary and unjust. Another word for this is speciesism, or as I like to say, human exceptionalism. So what are non-human animal rights? The fight for non-human animal rights focuses on the fact that non-human animals have their own inherent and fundamental interests, just as humans do, and calls for these interests to be protected. The interest in protecting one's autonomy, that is the right to be free from unwanted interference, is probably the most closely guarded right an individual can possess. And a non-human animal's interest in exercising their autonomy is as fundamental to them as it is to us. We argue that autonomy is simply at the heart to the right to bodily liberty. And courts care deeply about autonomy and, most importantly, about science. That's why we're focusing right now on animals for whom there is robust scientific evidence of autonomy. As I said, our first clients were chimpanzees and elephants because the science is clear that these non-human animals are autonomous and suffer in captivity. And interestingly, in 2005, Happy at the Bronx Zoo became the first elephant to pass the mirror self-recognition test, which is considered to be an indicator of self-awareness and autonomy. Now, perhaps you've heard of this chimpanzee. Her name is Washoe. Decades ago in a research facility, she was the first chimpanzee to be taught American Sign Language. She learned 250 signs and then taught them to other chimpanzees. She is well known for making these three statements: go out, open key, please open, which she used to ask a researcher to let her out of the room she was locked in. So as I said, we have three different approaches in our fight for non-human animal rights. The first is litigation. In the first of their kind lawsuits in the United States, we filed habeas corpus petitions on behalf of chimpanzees and elephants, arguing that the courts should recognize their right to bodily liberty, determine that their captivity was unlawful, and free them to an appropriate sanctuary. But why habeas corpus? Habeas corpus is the legal mechanism by which an imprisoned individual can seek judicial release even when the individual is a legal thing, as is the situation with non-human animals. For centuries, habeas corpus has been used to protect an individual's autonomy and secure liberty when the captivity is unjust, even when the captivity is otherwise lawful, which is a huge obstacle that we have to overcome with our litigation, because the first question that we are posed is, but how can you be asking for habeas corpus when the prisoners, when these non-human animals are being lawfully imprisoned? You are whether it be the Bronx Zoo, whether it be the owner of Tommy, they were not violating any animal welfare laws, federal, state, or local. So the judges say, how can you be asking for a writ of habeas corpus when the imprisonment is lawful? the answer is that, yes, it is lawful because it's tragic, because the animal welfare laws are so tragically inadequate. But the reason that we claim it's unlawful is because the right to bodily liberty is being violated. And that's not a statutory right, that's a common law right. So we file our habeas corpus petitions under the state common law because it's the law that judges make and evolve based on science, justice, equality, and liberty. With every habeas corpus petition we file, we submit affidavits from world-renowned scientists and other relevant experts who, on the basis of their own work, attest to the autonomy and extraordinary cognitive abilities of the imprisoned non-human animals and to the fact that they suffer in captivity. In filing these petitions, we have gained the support not only of the foremost species experts, but also experts on civil rights, habeas corpus, religion, philosophy, and more. Legislation, as Kathy mentioned, we had the unbelievable privilege of working with the Ojai, California City Council to pass the first piece of legislation in the country that defines and protects the legal right of a non-human animal, specifically an animal's right to liberty. The ordinance expressly recognizes that elephants possess the right to liberty and prevents anyone from preventing elephants from exercising that right. So the practical effect of the legislation is that no elephant will ever be imprisoned in Ojai, California. We intend to continue that work with other municipalities and hopefully move on to work on the state level. And in New York City, where I'm from, we're working with Council Member Hanif on a bill. While it's not a rights bill, it's a bill that would ban the keeping of elephants in the city, effectively forcing the Bronx Zoo to close their elephant exhibit. Education. I believe that education is the vehicle to change public opinion, and public opinion changes judges' opinions. What I've realized recently is talking to a lot of people that people genuinely understand the capacities and capabilities of chimpanzees, of elephants, of cetaceans. What they don't understand is that they suffer in captivity. When they see Happy swaying at the Bronx Zoo, they are being told that Happy is dancing. And I'm telling them, Happy's not dancing. Happy is engaging in stereotypical behavior. And what that stereotypical behavior is doing is giving her brain damage. And then I say to them, this is not what I'm saying. I am only the voice of the experts. And which really, in my opinion, counts for something. When you can tell people and tell the court that not based on my observations, but on the observations of decades of research, they believe it. We also recently launched the Free to Be Elephants website. It's a first of its kind education and grassroots campaign that tells the stories of imprisoned elephants and exposes the truth about elephant imprisonment in US zoos. So what has happened? It says Happy's Day in Court, but it's more than Happy's Day in Court. We recognize that change will take a very long time, as does any change that involves a shift in an entrenched paradigm and status quo. But having been with the Non-Human Rights Project for a very long time, what I have seen over the past 10 years since we filed the first lawsuit on behalf of Tommy is incredible progress. We secured the first habeas corpus hearing on behalf of a non-human animal in the United States, and that was on behalf of the chimpanzees Hercules and Leo. And then the first hearing on behalf of an elephant, that being Happy. And then the first time that the highest court of an English-speaking jurisdiction heard a habeas corpus case on behalf of a non-human animal, that being Happy's case heard by the New York State Court of Appeals. While the majority did not rule in favor of Happy's freedom, 2 of the 7 judges wrote powerful and lengthy dissents supporting Happy's right to liberty. One of the dissenting judges is now the chief judge of the Court of Appeals. And like the dissents in many other famous landmark civil rights cases, these dissents will help advocates fighting for non-human animal rights for years to come. We expect the number of judges on our side will continue until non-human animal rights are widely accepted and established. And I frequently say, most judges don't like to be the first to do something, especially when it's shifting the paradigm, when it's changing the status quo. So for a judge who is sympathetic to the idea of recognizing rights for at least certain non-human animals, this makes their life much easier to be able to point to other judges, particularly to now the chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals, and say, you know what, maybe it's not that far-fetched an idea. Cetaceans, the right to liberty. I just read an article. Who speaks for the whales? Lori, of course, was quoted in the article. Do you even know that? Yes. And so what I realized is I know very little about cetaceans, and but hope to learn a lot more in the very near future. In conclusion, Chief Judge Wilson, who was the dissenter, one of the dissenters in Happy's case, wrote, and I quote, "We should recognize Happy's right to petition for her liberty, not just because she is a wild animal who is not meant to be caged and displayed, but because the rights we confer on others define who we are as a society." In a nutshell, the idea of non-human animal rights is no longer a fringe concept. Public opinion, in large part based on science, has shifted such that animal rights is now part of the mainstream conversation, as evidenced by the incredible stories following our work in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, among so many others. Since the filing of the first petition, I have seen courageous judges and legislators apply the science to animal captivity. But what's so exciting is that we know the science is nascent and will only become more robust with time. Removing that first brick from the wall that separates non-human animals as rightless things from human beings is the hardest part of this journey. But that has been accomplished. It is now incumbent upon all of us to continue to break down that wall brick by brick. Thank you.
There. Well, first, I want to thank you so much for being here to commemorate Tokitae and to share space with us. And I also wanted to give a huge thanks to Kathy, to Georgia, to Lori, and to Elizabeth for so movingly encapsulating the ways in which our systems have failed Toki, from her cruel capture to her very preventable death. I am going to go, there we go. But a quick introduction first before I get started. My name is Miranda Eisen. I am the Outreach and State Policy Specialist at Farm Sanctuary, a national animal protection organization that offers sanctuary to rescued farm animals, that educates the public about the vast harms of animal agriculture, and that advocates for shifting resources away from factory farming and towards more just, equitable, and sustainable forms of plant-based agriculture. So I want to start by remembering Toki. She was born in Puget Sound, Washington in 1966 and spent 4 years living freely before she was captured and sold to the Miami Seaquarium. She spent 10 years in captivity with a fellow orca, Hugo, as Lori mentioned, who died of a brain aneurysm from the repeated bashing of his head. She then spent the rest of her life with various tank mates, including several dolphins and a pilot whale, but no other members of her own species, which earned her the name of the world's loneliest orca. She was forced to perform about twice a day for 52 years, and like was stated, she lived in the smallest orca tank in the United States. She was the oldest orca in captivity and died less than 5 months after the announcement that she would be moved home to her native waters. She died at 57 years old, though in the wild, like was shared, she could have lived into her 80s, 90s, or even 100 years old. So that's what Toki experienced, but it's incredibly difficult to find any information about who Toki was, her likes, her dislikes, her personality traits, or truly anything else that speaks to who she was as an individual being. Her former trainer recalls Toki's excellent memory for old tricks, but that reflection really just reinforces the fact that we are perceiving and understanding Toki within the confines of a deeply exploitative role. Sanctuary, as a concept in practice, which is what I'm very excited to be talking to you all about today, challenges such exploitative roles by emphasizing the inherent value and dignity of individual beings like Toki. At Farm Sanctuary, we love to share not just the lived experiences of animals, which are incredibly important, but also the special qualities that make each of our animal residents who they are as individuals, rather than solely the burdens that they must shoulder as members of a broader subjugated species population. So we threw around sanctuary. What is it? What is sanctuary? It can take on many meanings, but at Farm Sanctuary, we like to think about sanctuaries as spaces for healing, transformation, and multi-species community. For us and for many others, that manifests as a physical space that's dedicated to the protection and care of animals that have been rescued from violence, exploitation, neglect, or abuse. Farm Sanctuary's co-founder, Jean Bauer, founded the first farmed animal sanctuary in 1986, and since then, activists around the world have created hundreds of sanctuaries to provide safe and loving spaces for animals. Over the past 35 plus years since Farm Sanctuary was founded, sanctuaries have challenged norms around human-animal relationships in a number of ways. First, by providing safe and loving environments for formerly abused animals that are free of exploitation and forced breeding. Most animals in our world are victims of systemic oppression. Most people don't necessarily think of it in that way, but they are, right? Captive animals, their bodies, their minds, they are manipulated for food, research, clothing, and companionship. And non-captive wild animals, like Toki once was before she was captured, face habitat destruction, hunting, disease, and other human-driven afflictions. It's truly rare for most animals to experience refuge and tranquility, which just demonstrates how truly necessary sanctuary is. Sanctuaries also challenge human-animal norms by creating opportunities for animals to engage in innate species-specific behaviors. Whether it's in a factory farm or in an aquarium, captive animals are often unable to engage in the behaviors that come naturally to them. For our sanctuary residents, that's foraging for chickens, it's nest building for pigs, and for Toki, it's hunting prey, right? The corporations that are profiting off animal exploitation generally do not care about the well-being of the animals they confine or slaughter because it's expensive and because it's unnecessary to meet their bottom line. Sanctuaries, on the other hand, spend immense time and resources to create enriched environments for animals to freely be themselves and to satisfy their biological instincts. Lastly, sanctuaries are subversive in how they decenter humans and put the needs of animals first. Our relationships with animals are predominantly characterized by what humans want, right? For a lot of people, that's cheap meat, but it can also be warm socks or an entertaining afternoon. animals' perspectives are almost never considered, let alone incorporated into how we structure our interspecies interactions. Sanctuaries push back against this norm by appreciating and elevating the unique needs, desires, and personalities of animals. For example, in my time caring for animals at Farm Sanctuary as an on-site sanctuary intern, that looked like enjoying the sunset with Petunia, a wheelchair-bound lamb who needed to stretch her legs every night, but would routinely fall and need support to get back up and continue moving. A lot of people would maybe say that that is a waste of time and resources, but we know that it meant the world to Petunia, and that is truly all that matters. It's important to note that while sanctuaries disrupt exploitative norms in many crucial ways, in practice, they can't always live up to the ideals that they so firmly symbolize. Animal caregivers will tell you just how challenging caring for sanctuary residents can be, and that they have to make compromises for the well-being of the animals themselves, and often because sanctuaries are understaffed and underfunded. For instance, while sanctuaries aim to preserve animals' physical autonomy, animals usually still have to be confined within fixed boundaries. For farm sanctuaries' animal residents, that's because they have been domesticated and genetically manipulated to be unable to live their life in most conditions. They were made to live their lives in cages and in sheds. For Toki, it's because the mental and physical trauma that she endured and the long-standing detachment from a natural life made it so that she was unable to be instinctually able and capable of surviving in the wild. Other quandaries arise from the fact that animals cannot consent in ways that humans understand. Our relationship with them is really inherently paternalistic. From providing veterinary care to controlling their social interactions, sanctuaries, just like farmers and marine animal trainers, have a lot of power over animal lives. The key difference is that sanctuaries strive to maximize animal well-being within these forced power dynamics, while businesses abuse their power for personal gain at the expense of the animals they are confining. This subversion of power dynamics is really the touchstone of sanctuary. By constructing environments for animals to be more autonomous and joyful, sanctuaries help us believe that another world is possible, one where animals can receive the love and support they need in environments that are free of suffering and exploitation. Whoop. I don't know. There is supposed to be a video here, but that is okay. It does not seem that there is. I was going to show you a quick video because there's nothing better than seeing sanctuary with your own eyes, right? It was going to be a lovely video of Lenny and Freddie, two calves who escaped dairy farms and instead of facing a premature death at the hands of the veal or dairy industry, get to spend out the rest of their lives together in harmony, peace, and friendship. But for now, I encourage you to Google Lenny and Freddie Farm Sanctuary and see sanctuary for yourself.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yes, you want to continue?
Yeah. Seems like this is not going to work out, and that is totally okay. I encourage you to look up many pictures of sanctuary if you are ever in need of a smile. So, embracing a sanctuary ethos of care that creates safe and loving spaces for animals like Lenny and Freddie, it has also enabled humans to expand our perspectives on what knowledge is worth pursuing and how we obtain that knowledge. So at Farm Sanctuary, our researchers have developed a new model called sanctuary-based research that investigates the inner lives of animals in a consensual and mutually beneficial way. The research aims to improve the welfare of sanctuary residents and all members of targeted farmed animal species, making the purpose of the scientific inquiry the animals themselves rather than the usual human beneficiaries. The research also allows for the animal residents' voluntary participation and avoids suffering, invasive methods, and other known sources of harm. From exploring whether chickens experience joy when they're learning to whether cows experience PTSD in a similar manner as humans, the sanctuary-based research program at Farm Sanctuary demonstrates that the empirical study of animals is possible not only without animal suffering, but in a way that directly benefits animals themselves. And this innovative program that shifts the traditional animal experimentation paradigm is only possible because the sanctuary setting enabled it. In expanding our conceptions of animal care and a lot else through sanctuary, countless animals have experienced enhanced quality of life, while humans have become more creative in their ability to care for animals and save lives. And the benefits of reimagining interspecies social relations through sanctuary extend far beyond this one example. Sanctuaries are also indispensable tools for education and social change. Sanctuary visitors and followers gain a much better understanding of animals' sentience, their will to live, their remarkable resilience, and their capacity for love and forgiveness. By interacting with animals and seeing them as living beings rather than simply objects for use, sanctuaries inspire people to reconsider their preconceptions about animals' roles and responsibilities in our greater society. Researchers are just beginning to confirm what Farm Sanctuary has known for years, that through sanctuary tours, visitors are seeing animals, often for the first time, as individuals worthy of respect and care. For instance, a 2020 study conducted by Faunalytics showed that sanctuary visitors who ate animal products were more likely to report wanting to reduce their consumption of meat and other animal products after the tour than before it, and that they had a stronger understanding of the link between dietary choices and animal suffering. It's studies like these that reveal just how powerful sanctuary tours can be in shifting perspectives and real-life behaviors about how compassionate we truly can be with one another and with other animals. We also see the power of sanctuary, of caring deeply for others and making physical and emotional space to protect them from violence in other social contexts beyond just the human-animal relationship. Municipalities and state governments have passed laws to become sanctuary cities and states, whereby they protect vulnerable populations in need of support. Right here in DC, council members unanimously passed the Sanctuary Values Act of 2020, which restricts cooperation between local city agencies like DC jails and police, and the Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, to protect immigrant families and individuals. And in my home state of Oregon, individuals who are seeking abortion can come and receive the medical, financial, and logistical services they need that they might not be able to receive in their home state. By fostering spaces that protect oppressed populations from oppressive systems, regardless of species or backgrounds, we ground our collective coexistence in principles of empathy, care, and mutual aid. In a political and economic system that teaches us as individuals to fend for ourselves, community care through sanctuary offers a life-supporting path towards a more just world. And it's through this community care, through sanctuary, that we can strengthen our capacity for positive and proactive change, both individually and systemically. What is amazing about sanctuary, one of my personal favorite things, is that it sits at the intersection of meaningful individual interspecies relationships and community education, outreach, and advocacy. Sanctuary on an individual level is all about appreciating the inherent worth of undervalued individuals and intangibly improving their quality of life. While sanctuary on a systemic level is all about anchoring ourselves in these individual relationships and connections to spur collective action for systemic change. I think we can take a look at what thousands of people have done for Toki because they felt a personal connection to her. They organized to rescue her because they saw her individual story and cared deeply. For decades, advocates have fought for Toki by organizing and hosting global protests, by filing several lawsuits, which were kind of talked about today around suing the Seaquarium for violations of the Endangered Species Act, and also suing the USDA for not holding the Seaquarium accountable for Animal Welfare Act violations. But also by successfully urging companies like TripAdvisor, Airbnb, the Miami Ford dealership, and other businesses to cut ties to the Seaquarium, to stop supporting it. And also by supporting an Indigenous-led 27-day, 13-stop tour from Washington State to Florida to educate and organize for Toki's release. Toki's horrendous lived experience led to actions that created immense progress. But tragically, as we know, for Toki, it was too late. At Farm Sanctuary and beyond, we know that we cannot rescue every single animal in need, and that we are heartbroken, not only for Toki, but for every single animal that does not receive sanctuary in the way that they need and deserve. But right now, we can channel that frustration and sadness into action to manifest lasting change. I'm not saying this is easy. Living in extractive systems that don't see animals as worthy of consideration can make us often feel that systemic and cultural transformation is impossible. But everyone on this panel, and so many more people, provide hopeful glimpses into the future that we can co-create by building the good in various ways. The pivotal example before us was the effort to bring Toki to sanctuary. It showed that the impossible is possible. We can provide sanctuary, thanks to people like Lori, for some of the world's largest aquatic animals. We can also look to the recent evolution of animal law. Our very own Kathy Hessler was the first full-time animal law professor, and now she's integrating animal legal education into classrooms, courtrooms, and governmental offices across the country. World Aquatic Animal Day 2024, which Kathy mentioned at the beginning, which will be hosted by Farm Sanctuary and GW Law School, will build on these stories of positive change, showcasing the many ways that we can come together across movements to build the good for all of us, animals, people, and the planet. We hope that you will join us at this event next April and continue supporting Sanctuary wherever you may find it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a little join us for World Aquatic Animal Day. Now, I can, we have time for questions. Let me stop sharing the screen. Okay. We'll leave it like that for the time being. Yes.
Yes, I have two questions. Well, the most important one is for Miranda right now because it's. But do you have sanctuaries for orcas right now, or is only releasing them back to the sea the only choice?
That is a great question. So at Farm Sanctuary, we only work with terrestrial animals and rescue them. So I'm actually gonna leave that question with Lori, if that's okay.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, my question is do you have any other alternative to releasing, for example, orcas back to the sea? As for example, do you have any kind of the possibility of constructing sanctuary for cetaceans?
Absolutely. The Whale Sanctuary Project, the nonprofit that I'm the president of, and we are creating a sanctuary for orcas and beluga whales in Nova Scotia. We have a 200-acre water space, and we have just completed all of our environmental studies, and we're getting ready to start construction. So that sanctuary will be modeled after all of the authentic sanctuaries that exist for land animals. And the Baltimore Aquarium, the National Aquarium, is creating a sanctuary for their 7 bottlenose dolphins. And there are others. So marine mammals, cetacean sanctuaries are coming online.
That's great. So my second question was for Elizabeth Stein. Elizabeth, you, as far as I understand, you work with the case for Tokitae with Stephen Weiss, right?
Yes.
So far, the non-human rights project is focusing, as you said, specifically in habeas corpus.
Yes.
Because once you get one of those cases, at least you have a precedent.
Yes.
And that didn't go so well for Tony, as far as I know. I don't know where he is, but that's not my question. My question is, would it be possible for you or other members of the Non-Human Rights Project to work with, for example, Miranda, in order perhaps not to get with the habeas corpus the release of the animal, but any other applicable law just to get them to a sanctuary? In the case of orcas, who don't get under the protection from 1972, there are not so many right now, right, alive. So for them, it would be very late if we are waiting for not human rights for them, at least to the level that you want to get them, which is laudable, but it could be too late. So is there any other legal alternative, for example, for the last ones, the remaining ones, to legally release them to a sanctuary specifically designed for cetaceans?
Do you want to start about it?
Because I mean, I think you
Go ahead.
No.
No, because we're just too polite. I just want to make sure I totally understand your question. So what you're asking is limited to cetaceans.
So far, no animal has received a habeas corpus in the United States.
That's correct, but
And
we're getting very close.
It can take 20 to 30 years, who knows? And in the meantime, the last cetaceans that were caught before the law came into being are still in captivity. So for them, it may be too late if we are waiting for that great first case in habeas corpus. I'm asking for alternatives.
Yes, no, and I totally understand your question. So, I hope this answers the question. Everything takes an extraordinary amount of time, whether it be litigation, whether it be legislation. So I'm not sure that, I mean, certainly if a law could get passed to do that, that would be fantastic. I mean, absolutely fantastic, which is why, we don't exclusively do litigation. We also are involved with legislation, as I was saying, with the Ojai ban, but rather the Ojai right to liberty. But what I think the third prong is, because the litigation can take a very long time, the legislation can take a very long time, public pressure sometimes can really fill in the gaps where these things might take longer. And putting pressure on SeaWorld, on not even SeaWorld, what Miranda was talking about, various companies who work with, there has to be pressure has to be brought to bear on the captors, whether it be SeaWorld, whoever is imprisoning these non-human animals. And generally, the pressure has to be in the pocketbook. And if people are still going to the Bronx Zoo, if they're still going to SeaWorld, things from that perspective are not going to change, which is why the litigation, the legislation becomes so vital. And I understand, I thought, yes, we have not, if we're talking about the work of the Non-Human Rights Project, we haven't yet succeeded in getting one of our clients released, but we are getting so close. And when you see the shift in front of you, you know you have to keep on trying. And, what we're looking for is, we believe that non-human animals should have rights. Public pressure is not, it's wonderful. And if that's how you can get the animal out, fantastic. But we believe that animals deserve rights.
I'll add really quickly that that there are a lot. Sorry, you want to go ahead? Go ahead, Georgia.
Sure.
Yeah.
One of the difficulties we've had, and I think this will speak to your question, as you probably know, to sue and get any kind of relief, you need standing. The community has had a very hard time developing standing for something like, if you're someone who goes to an aquarium and you are very upset to see Tokitae in captivity or any other cetacean or marine mammal or any animal really. This has been tried for primates as well, for non-human primates. If you're very upset to see that happening, it physically hurts you. One of the challenge has been, they're like the Animal Welfare Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, they don't have citizen suit provisions. So there's basically without sort of a government decision in the form of a permit, for example, there's not really a way to challenge that captivity. And does that make sense?
Yes, it does, but in other countries it hasn't done. For example, in Argentina, with Sandra the orangutan, and I know Stephen was criticized a little bit the decision, but at least from my point of view, they got what they wanted.
So the challenge in the US is that we don't have the same constitutional structures that and I will also say that there have been some states and jurisdictions, local jurisdictions within states in the US that have tried to pass rights of nature laws. And they have unfortunately been struck down. So we're not winning on that. But the main point is lots of people are trying lots of different things. There have been animals released into sanctuary from from research facilities, from roadside zoos, from other, sort of situations. And so what we're talking about is just some of the options that people are trying around the country. This is not everything, right?
I know, my point is that perhaps if we use, I don't know in the case of cetaceans, but at least to other animals, we have laws for well-being, welfare.
So my point is simply that people are trying all of those things. And I just want to get a couple more questions in. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thanks for the great panel. This is for Kathy or any of the panelists. Do you know examples of restorative justice being used to help restore well-being to any of the animals that have been harmed?
So restorative justice is, for folks who don't know, it's a different conceptualization of how to use legal structures, right, to remediate harms more holistically, rather than the harms that sometimes the law only looks at narrowly. And so I think some of the things that Miranda has suggested would be examples of that happening. So sanctuary space, but not in the legal setting, not in a mandated way, right? So only that I'm aware of, when people have chosen to try to remediate the harms that animals have suffered. I'm not aware of any single instance when a court has ordered a restorative justice approach. Thanks. Sorry, yeah. Other questions here? I know there are some online. So let's go to online. Tanisha, if you want to unmute yourself. Thank you for waiting. Tanisha, let me see if I can unmute. Okay. Let's see. Tanisha?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Everyone, thank you to the panel. Just on all information. I obviously coming in, I already cared, and you just pulled on my heartstrings even more, if that was even possible. So thank you to all of you. So I am actually trying to go right now for my doctorate degree in wildlife justice as well as environmental justice. I feel like a lot of times we have to do things not just with people, but obviously the planet itself, and that includes every species of animal that's here, which I include us into that. And so what I'm wondering and wanting to know is, while we're talking about pressure, do you know much about accountability? Because that's kind of where I want to lead into is, what are we doing to make sure when we put the pressure, we're doing the legislation, where is the accountability to make sure, okay, this is what will happen to you when you don't listen, and who's pushing that forward? Where is that department, if there is any?
Did anyone want to start? I mean, there is no department, right, for accountability. I think, yeah, George, you want to?
I mean, again, this is just one small part of it, but one of the things that the NGO community does is, we try to keep tabs on as many facilities as possible. And when we hear or see things that we, believe to be in violation of the law or the regs, we can file complaints, typically with APHIS. And sometimes those complaints end up resulting in investigations, citations, and granted, that I'm talking Animal Welfare Act here, so again, the base level, but
That's right. And I think, so there are different levels of accountability, right? So there's the accountability when the government fails. There's accountability when legal action, has been taken and it isn't followed through. When that fails sort of throughout the justice system, there's accountability for businesses. There's accountability even for nonprofit organizations, right? And so I think we're as a community trying to get better at that. One of the challenges I've seen is that there's so much information out there that people can be putting this data out there and saying, this needs to be followed up on. These people haven't done what they promised to do. And it kind of gets lost, right, in the noise of everything that's going on. So I think we can do it better. I think your question calls us to consider that. And that's a good reminder for all of us to try and hold ourselves and one another accountable.
And I think that's part of the issue with legislation. Very often there is no accountability. There should be accountability because it's structured into the law itself. But if you're not enforcing it, or if you are enforcing it, but the enforcers are turning a blind eye to it, you have a lack of enforcement and you have laws that really have no teeth.
Yeah. So we have another question online from Madison for Liddy, saying, I remember asking Steve Wise about Toki and he stated they wouldn't pursue a case because of the jurisdiction, understandably, but do you think a petition for her would have capitalized on the media frenzy from SeaWorld and Blackfish to push public opinion in her support?
It's a great question. The problem is that we will never file a petition until we are prepared to file the petition. So with our elephants, with our chimpanzees, we had affidavits from the foremost, whether it be primatologists or elephant experts, that took us years to accumulate. And so it takes a very, very long time to be able to get a petition ready. And, we would not have been there. We don't have the experts yet. Hopefully, working with Lori, we will be gathering that information and we will be gathering the experts so that in the future we will be able to do that. But we just couldn't have done it. The jurisdiction aside, which I really, don't feel that I would be capable of addressing, but just the whole practical aspect of it, it takes a very, very long time.
And I just add to that. So, Toki was on her way to her natal waters via the efforts of Friends of Toki. And that was something that was underway. And unfortunately, it didn't happen because of her health, but there, sometimes just takes one individual who has the means to say, I want to get this individual out of that situation, and it can happen. So, there's that way of doing things as well.
Yeah, it's good to remember that we were on the path, and that's why it's so sad.
Our video has been turned off.
Yeah, and there we go. I didn't have the option to jump back on. Hold in. So we have a couple more online questions. So one for Lori, when do you think the whale sanctuary would be fully operational, or is it still too early to say?
Well, we have been working very, very diligently to try to become operational as soon as possible. We just finished our environmental analysis. So after that, few other things, but we are very, very close to applying for our lease to start developing the site itself. What that means is buildings, nets in the water. We've been at it for, about 3 years now, since 2020, when we announced that the site was the site we wanted to pursue. So perhaps next year. We have been saying, next year for a couple of years now, but it is important for people to understand how complex it is to create something like this. And the next year, it really should be translated into not putting it off, but to as soon as possible, we are going to do it.
And then we'll celebrate.
Yeah.
And I think, so we have one online and one in the room from Olivia. If you want to unmute yourself, Olivia. And I know it sometimes takes a moment. Olivia? Oh, it won't let her unmute, and I don't have the option to unmute you. Do you want to just put the question then in the chat, Olivia, and we'll do the one in the room first? We'll try it that way. Thanks.
It was just a follow-on to Laurie. Do you have any animals in your sites in terms of ones that need rescuing and relocating?
Yeah, we actually do. I mean, that's the other part of it, is the sanctuary itself, and then who's going to live there. And so you have to work on that simultaneously. There are orcas in France, in Antibes, who are set to be moved to Japan. We would like to have a discussion about perhaps finding a path for them to our sanctuary when it's completed. As a family that should be kept together. There are beluga whales in South Korea and in Taiwan. And of course, there's also Marineland Canada in Ottawa that really basically, they have 35 beluga whales. And we continuously reach out to them to see if they would like to work with us to bring some of those whales to our sanctuary when it's completed. So we do have our eye on a few facilities and a few individuals and groups of individuals.
Thank you.
Another question on line, it seems to follow that, which is how do we get Corky to Double Bay? Which I assume is for you, Lori, getting Corky into...
First you have to finish Double Bay. Double Bay is a sanctuary space in British Columbia that was put together by an individual who basically restored an eco lodge, and it's a beautiful site. I've been out there, and he would like to create a space for Corky and perhaps a companion. And the reason that space is important is because she's a northern resident, and so she would be back in her natal waters the way Tokitae would have been. And he is he's making progress, but it takes a long time to create a sanctuary for animals, period, and for aquatic animals like whales, even longer. So I think that we'll just have to see, but it's underway. It's a beautiful site.
And then I think we need the work that AWI and others did to put pressure on the facilities to agree to release, because right now we don't have a lever to force release. But I think as George's presentation really well showed, there was a confluence of legal efforts that one by one made it more and more untenable, right, to keep Toki in captivity. And then also came a nice big donor who offered to.
And then also the transfer of ownership, the old owner
Never would
have
have.
considered it,
Right.
but the new owner it's the dolphin company, and they're really not interested in orcas, and they, so they were more willing to, give this consideration.
Yeah, to give them credit though, they were willing to talk to the people on the outside and let people in, new veterinarians and
Right.
so forth. So, and that's so important, that collaborative spirit.
Which I think is missing from so many,
Oh,
the
yeah.
whole collaborative effort.
So it looks like that's all of the online questions. Do we have any other questions in the room? I know we're over time, so thank you for letting us go over because we started a little late. Thank you for your patience with the technology. Other questions? And if not, then please join me. Oh, yeah,
I think is it Olivia? Did she write a question then?
not yet that I've
I
seen.
thought I saw one. Okay, sorry.
Let's see, because I wouldn't want to miss it.
Oh, let's see.
So I see Madison.
How can we? Oh.
What's this?
Oh, wait,
I saw
yeah, I
that
think
you
it's at
had
the bottom.
said, talking about
There we go, thank
generated
you.
aquariums.
So the question is, I saw a computer generated aquarium online a few months back, and it's a facility where people go and all the animals people see are computer generated, but it looks extremely real. This would provide the need for people to visit places and see the animals up close, but without actually keeping animals in captivity. Is anyone aware of any movement towards that in aquariums or zoos? So did you want to start? Go ahead.
I don't know specifically about aquariums or zoos. Maybe some are going in this direction, but there are definitely people looking into this, and it's going to be, I think, a thing that will be pretty big in the future.
There are a couple of zoos that are starting to incorporate this into their exhibits. So one as a way to give people more experience and more background and to see what the animals might look like, to supplement the animals that they currently have. And so I think, the question is, can we move towards replacing the animals and doing this experience? It's a virtual reality. There's also, when we were at Lewis and Clark, Miranda and I, we were trying to work on a project to do virtual reality sanctuaries, farm sanctuary visits. So people who couldn't go to a sanctuary could have that experience. And I think there's some people still working on that. So I think we're moving in that direction. I think there are more voices saying this is what we want, and please, ask the people at your local zoos and aquaria. Maybe that will make it go a little more quickly. Other thoughts on that?
I was just, you're going to say something?
Jump in.
That I think it's also education, that when people understand when they go to a zoo and they're looking at, and I go back to Happy all of the time, that all they're seeing is a shell of an elephant. They are not seeing, if they're going to see if they're trying to teach their children what an elephant is like in the wild, they are not doing that. All they're showing is an elephant who is being tortured. And if we can get people to understand that they will actually see more if they did something like that, I think that there would be a bigger push. Something is going on. I don't want to give the wrong information at the Museum of Natural History in New York City. I know one of our elephant experts was just there because they're doing a whole elephant exhibit that is supposed to be extraordinary and so realistic that you feel as though you're actually with the elephants. And that's what we need to be doing. And again, it's the whole idea of not using animals for the sake of human entertainment. It's keeping animals for their own sake.
I think, please.
Just to mention, there are people who have created animatronic dolphins and had people swimming with them. You know how people like to swim with
Right.
dolphins. And they have just as good a time. They start to relate to the robotic dolphin as though it is a real dolphin. And I think that shows that, you know, people can suspend they have imagination enough to be able to have a good time with a representation of an animal who is not an actual animal suffering in a tank or on display. And I just wanted to mention Marine Land Canada is in Ontario. So I misspoke there. So I just wanted to mention that.
And with a robotic dolphin, you don't have a chance of getting bit.
That's right. That's right. And you do get bit when you swim with dolphins.
Through no fault of the dolphins.
Or
Because you shouldn't be there.
They don't want
Right.
Yeah, and no biting definitely happens in the virtual content that Farm Sanctuary creates to be able to show folks what it is like to visit animals at Farm Sanctuary. We know that most animal sanctuaries, including our own, are in rural areas where folks might not always be able to access. And so we have content for our education program. We also have content on our social media channels. Facebook, Instagram, like the video I was hopefully going to show you today, which I encourage you to look up to be able to see what these animals are like within, without the confines of these exploitative systems we've created, to be able to act freely and joyfully. And we find those videos to be incredibly powerful, to change lives, to open hearts and minds, and also, like we were saying, to change systems. So yeah, excited to continue to work with Kathy, that's for sure.
Well, and this education is all the more important because as we're talking about the work that needs to be done, it's to offset the continuing education that's happening in aquariums and zoos that reinforces, right, this property status of animals and that use is appropriate. And when you think this is where we take our children, right, this is where we teach them that this is okay. And so that education is continuing while we're trying to offer an alternative educational perspective. And so we have to try and dismantle the one while we're bolstering the other. But that's why these things take a long time and there's a lot of work. But I want to be sensitive to everyone's time and thank you for your attendance and your great questions. And join me, please, in thanking again this wonderful panel.